Hey there! Today we're going to go ahead and discuss the 13 colonies. Now, when we refer to the 13 colonies, please understand, guys, that what we are talking about are the English colonies as run by England during the early to mid 1700s. Now, these 13 colonies were all located on what is today's east coast of the United States, and they could easily be broken down into three colonial regions. So if we take a look at the map, this is what the states would look like as they were formed today. We have Georgia, South and North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Because, of course, at the time, Vermont and Maine were not a part of those 13 original colonies. Now, with that being said, here's in fact what our 13 colonies would have actually looked like at the time. The shapes are not the same as what our states look like today. A lot of that had to do with the fact that if we were to look along this line here, what essentially separated the 13 colonies from the rest of the continent were what are known as the Appalachian Mountains. And England kept its colonies all the way to the east of those colonies, of those mountains at the time, in order to keep the peace with a lot of the Native Americans who already inhabited the lands before England arrived. If we look here up in the north, this would have been French-controlled Canada at the time. Now, as far as Vermont, well, that at the time was actually part of basically the Indian Territories and New York. And Maine, well, honestly, Maine was actually part of Massachusetts colony. So, before we really get into how these colonies are divided into regions, first we have to answer, what is a region? Well, long story short, it's an area or division of land that shares common characteristics, but does not always mean they have a hard boundary. Now, these common characteristics can be anything from land formations, weather, water. If we think about where Colorado is, we're actually part of what's known as the Rocky Mountain region because we share the common characteristic of the Rocky Mountains with several other states. So, with that being the case, how did our colonies actually get divided into regions? Well, simply put, it was actually across four, give or take, categories. The first one had to do with land, and in this case, the lay of the land, so geography. Now, when it came to the colonies, a lot of that had to do with how good was the land for farming, so how much agriculture could they actually do. The second one had to do with money, so our exchanges and interactions. This is what makes what we call the economy. Now, when it came again into playing with how these colonies divided themselves into regions, the economy had to do with whether or not it was agricultural, so farm-based, or industry, so factory-based. We can also take a look at climate. How were these colonies divided by what would be like their typical weather conditions? Did they receive a lot of snowfall, a lot of rain? What was humidity like? And lastly, of course, are peoples. Now notice I use the plural, not people, but peoples. And that's because when we speak about populations and diversity, multiple cultures form different groups of people. So then we can use that plural of peoples to refer to all the different cultures within a region. So let's take a look at each of these regions individually. Now, at the very north of these 13 colonies was what were known as the New England colonies. Now, these colonies included, of course, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. And the big chunk of land up here that would one day become Maine, well, that was also Massachusetts colony. Now, when it came to the colonies in the New England colony region, a big common thing they shared was the fact that their land was actually not so great for farming. It was tended to be very rocky and thin, and truth be told, did not make it really great or fertile enough to make crops for any type of monetary gain. All right, a lot of farming was what's known as subsistence, or basically you'd farm enough to help your family survive. Now, as far as climate goes, New England colonies' climate tended to be cold with rather harsh winters, and that sometimes made the rest of their seasons appear to be a little bit shorter. Now, you combine that with the land, and what you have is a situation where farming is just not going to make it as part of their economic system. So for this particular area, we see the economy really being focused on industry, all right? They have grain and sawmills. They have timber mills. We see shipbuilding and actually quite a bit of cod fishing thanks to all of that wonderful water that they are right there located by. Now, when it came to diversity of peoples, to be very honest, this region does not have a huge diversity of people, all right? During this time period, the people that predominantly or mainly inhabited these colonies tended to be from England. Most were white. Many of them had very large families, and they also tend to be very, very religious. Now, our middle colonies at this time consisted of New York and that area here, which would be claimed by both New York and New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Now, in the case of this particular set of colonies, what we see happening here, guys, is the land here actually tended to be very, very rich farmland. As far as crops, they had diversity between different types of grain. They also had different types of vegetables, and they had so much that they actually had a surplus. Now, thanks to that surplus, they were able to trade these goods with other colonies for things they didn't have. And this actually led them to be known, of the time, of course, as the breadbasket colonies. Now, at the same time, what we see happening, guys, is a very moderate climate. So long growing periods from early springs into late falls allowed for that huge intake of their farming, which means that their economy was actually very much based on agriculture. Now, with that being said, this economy also had a mix of both skilled and unskilled workers. So you would have individuals who were known for, like, say, leatherworking or ironwork, glasswork, fabrics and textiles, but at the same time also had that mix of people raising livestock and grain for monetary exchange. Now, unlike the New Hampshire or the New England colonies, the diversity of peoples here was actually really large. We see a variety of cultures and religions, a mix of individuals from Europe, a mix of the native or indigenous people, so the native tribes, all working together in this particular set of colonies. Our last region, known as the Southern Colonies, was the region that included our states now of Georgia, South and North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. And as we look at this map, you're going to notice right away that this map actually includes a key at the bottom. And the reason for that is because this particular area of our country at this time was heavily agricultural. Now, with that being the case, understand that a lot of the farming here happened in large tracts or acreage of farmland. And the geography of the land was very different depending upon where you were. So areas like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina tended to have a lot of hillside versus the more flat territories of land in the South Carolinas and Georgia. And of course, with that being said, that means that you see crop differences. Tobacco actually became the massive crop of Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. But as you head south, we see things like indigo and rice, as well as, if you look here, rum manufacturing, thanks to the island's location in the Caribbean. Now, the climate here is ideal for farming, being very hot and very humid, being incredibly long growing seasons. In some of the more southern colonies, those growing seasons can extend even into their winter months. So when it came to this economy, what we see is a very heavily agricultural economy, oftentimes with specialization, meaning they focus on specific crops. But a big negative is that they relied heavily on slave labor. Now, if we take a look at economy, guys, and we think about how people make money, a reliance on slave labor means that they actually relied on a good portion of the money they made coming from what could be considered to be free labor of this time period. This is going to become a major point of discussion when we start looking at the American Revolution all the way through the Civil War. Now, when it comes to diversity in this particular region, what we see is actually a variety of cultures, thanks to a lot of the immigrants, such as the German and Scottish and Irish who were there. We also have the forced immigration of slavery into this region, And then even there, it gets subdivided once again into 3 different categories of farmer, where we have what are known as the elite or white plantation farmers. We have our yeoman farmers, which are our immigrant workers. And then lastly, we see our slave population. All right, so now that we've gone over the 3 regions together, your next step is to go back into Google Classroom, open up the activity sheets that are in Google Classroom. Now, this will include an organizer and a reading. And in combination with this video, go ahead and complete the organizer.